March 27th, Niles Eldridge will be in this same auditorium, probably about the same time, talking about the topic of the great debate on evolution, not if, but how. And we will also have another speaker in this series, Max Bothwell, who will be talking about algal communities and evolution in those communities. Let me tell you a little bit about how we originally came up with this idea. We started out with this idea that we were going to have a debate for this first talk. There was going to be a debate on the question of, I guess, what has been variously called as scientific creationism or special creation versus the idea of evolution. And in thinking about this, on the side of the creationists, we were going to bring in an individual known as Duane Gish. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of Duane Gish, but Duane Gish is sort of you might say a Goliath on the side of creationism. And in fact, if we were to do a poll of people in this country, I've been told that there would be more people who had heard of Duane Gish than those who had heard of, say, Niles Eldridge or Stephen Jay Gould, who were on the evolution side. So in thinking about this debate, if we were going to get Duane Gish to come speak about creationism or creation science, we needed to get a David to come in and speak on the other side. So some of the first people we were thinking about were Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge, who were two real big league people in the area of evolution. I called up Niles Eldridge and I said, this is what we want to do. And he said, well, I don't do that. You know, there are plenty of people who are scientists that are good scientists or excellent scientists that really don't have the kind of ability necessarily to explain things to people who are not experts in the field. And whether or not this fits Niles Eldridge's case or not, he realized that that's not something that he wanted to do. He didn't want to get into a situation where he was explaining evolution side against or versus somebody who was explaining creationism side to an audience that is not necessarily going to be up on all the particulars. And so I said, well, okay, you don't do this. Who's good? And he says, well, I've got somebody that is just the person you're looking for. And that person happens to be Genie Scott, who you're going to be hearing this evening. Now, for one reason or other, this debate didn't come about, but Genie Scott, that is Dr. Eugenia Scott, is going to be the person that we are going to have this evening talking about the topic of just when you thought it was safe to teach evolution. So we've actually given her a more difficult task in that not only does she have to talk about evolution, but she also has to present the other side as well. What can I say about Genie Scott before she talks? Let me whip out some stuff here. Let's see, if I read from the announcement, we have Dr. Scott is an expert on the application and explanation of the scientific method to non-scientists. She specializes in evolution and physical anthropology. Well, in fact, she's a PhD. She got her PhD from the University of Missouri. She did a 10-year stint in Wildcat territory at UK. So she's familiar with this territory and some of the things that go on. She is currently the director of the National, right here, the National Center for Science Education.
Correct.
Good, thank you. Okay, and her job, what she does, is basically explain the scientific perspective to people who aren't necessarily experts in that area. And this has taken various tracks. For instance, she is a fellow with
The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims for the Paranormal.
Okay, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims for the Paranormal. Okay, so that means she is somebody who's presenting a scientific perspective on things like ESP, out-of-body experiences, or OBEs as she calls them. She just did, her most recent thing that I heard about was that she was on the Geraldo Rivera show talking about near-death experiences from a scientific perspective. Okay? Now, to give you a little bit better idea of what you're about to experience, let me read, I have an excerpt to read from a letter that she sent me along with her itinerary. Let's see, dear Mike, etc., etc., etc. I am a middle-aged white lady with short hair and glasses, somewhat pear-shaped. Which I found out not to be the case, so I had a hard time finding her. I probably won't have a carnation in my teeth, but I imagine we will find one another anyway. I think you have an idea of what you're about to expect. I venture to say that we won't be bored. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Genie Scott, who I think will interest and amuse us.
I don't usually write my own introductions like that. Good evening. I am very delighted to see such a nice crowd. I will figure this out. One of the problems with being middle-aged is that you end up with bifocals, and I actually need trifocals, but I refuse to get them, so I will probably be able to get this on sooner or later. Here we go. I direct a nonprofit science education organization, as Dr. Perlman just described, called the National Center for Science Education. And we promote evolution education and education in the nature of science, which places us in opposition to a group of people calling themselves scientific creationists. When I tell this to college-level scientists, I am met with shakes of the head, looks of bewilderment. You mean that's still going on? I was describing to a friend of mine today who teaches on this campus that I spend a lot of my time whacking scientists over the head with 2x4s, grabbing them by the scruff of the neck and saying, yes, this is a serious problem and you have to take it seriously. It's almost as if I was telling them that I worked for an organization that defended the sphericity of the Earth against proponents of flat Earthism. Could I have the first slide, please? And then just leave it on and I'll do it here. How can anyone in the 20th century, and the late 20th century at that, ignore such a vast array of modern scientific evidence that evolution has occurred? Surely the proponents of scientific creationism are a small number of uniformly benighted, hopelessly misinformed, nay ignorant, troglodytes unworthy of serious consideration by educated people. All they need is a little dose of scientific evidence on evolution and they will swiftly see the error of their ways. Well, the truth is actually somewhat different. The adherents to the movement called scientific creationism, and by the way, I hope you hear the quotation marks around the word scientific when I say scientific creationist, because I do not believe, and I will try to convince you, that this is not a scientific movement at all. But the adherents of this movement are not a small number, but number in the tens of thousands. They are also highly motivated and feel sincerely that they have a mission to save the rest of us. Furthermore, rather than being uneducated, some of them actually have graduate degrees, and not just from Bible colleges either. And far from ignoring them, scientists should take them very seriously. Scientific creationists are having a substantial negative effect on American education. I give talks to university audiences and I also talk to high school audiences. And in almost every case I say something along the line of give me 24 hours and no matter where I am, what town, what city, what state, I will either find a teacher who is teaching creationism or one that is afraid to teach evolution. And when I say this to college audiences, I'm met by just looks of astonishment. No, you can't mean that. Certainly not. And when I say this to high school teachers, they sit very politely and wait for me to make my next point. They're not surprised to hear this at all. They know. They know about teachers who have been pressured not to teach evolution. They know about teachers who are actually teaching creationism. They know about the school board elections where fundamentalists run on creationist platforms. As I say, some teachers are actually teaching creationism. They know that about 20 years of textbooks that avoid discussing evolution or qualify it in ways no other scientific theory is qualified, or which leave a few pages which mention the E word safely in the back of the book, where they can be conveniently skipped. Just recently, in my state of California, we had a row about textbooks. Evolution Theory's Foes Win Textbook Battle in California from the New York Times. This is also was a New York Times Wire story. Textbooks to Soften Evolution Fact. Evolution Row Erupts at Textbook Panel. Well, generally speaking, university scientists have no clue about what I'm talking about. A headline like Evolution Row Erupts at Textbook Panel makes about as much sense to them as would this kind of a headline. Particle Physics Row Erupts at Textbook Panel. You do wonderful things with desktop publishing, can't you? That is because the creation-evolution controversy is thought of by scientists as a scientific controversy, and it isn't. It is a social and political movement, which is at heart the most recent manifestation of American anti-evolutionism. But as I mentioned a moment ago, there are a number of scientists with graduate degrees who support scientific creationism. It's a truly fascinating question, what makes these people tick? Why is it that a scientist would embrace something like this? It's a wonderful topic. I don't have time to go into it tonight. I can recommend a very good book that has just come out a couple of months ago by Raymond Eve and Francis Harold, called The Creationist Movement in Modern America. This is a social psychological analysis of these people calling themselves scientific creationists. It's excellent, and if during the question period you are curious about why people with good degrees in science would embrace scientific creationism, I'd be happy to talk about those motivations. However, any talk is an exercise in what you leave out, and that's something I've just chosen to leave out. What I do want to talk about is the creation-evolution controversy in the U.S. today. I want to talk about what creationists think, give you some examples of their, quote, science. I want to demonstrate why scientists reject it, and discuss some of the effects the scientific creationists are having on education today. Now, of necessity, I'll have to discuss or at least define evolution, but I hope I'm not disappointing Mike when I tell you that I'm not going to defend evolution. Evolution needs about as much defense as does the sphericity of the Earth. I mean, in a sense, why are we defending something that is so well established in the scientific world? Well, although creationists publicly claim that all they want is equal time, if you teach evolution, then it's only fair to teach creationism as well. What they really want is for evolution to simply disappear from our schools and from our society. They feel that evolution is an evil idea that has caused untold sorrow in society and from which our children should be protected. This quotation from Henry Morris expresses that view very clearly. Actually, it says Dwayne Gish here. I apologize. The slide is an error. It's actually Henry Morris. He says, evolution is the foundation, I have to take a deep breath here, actually, of communism, fascism, Freudianism, social Darwinism, behaviorism, Keynesianism, materialism, atheism, and in the religious world, modernism and neo-orthodoxy. Jesus said a good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit. In view of the bitter fruit yielded by the evolutionary system over the past 100 years, a closer look at the nature of the tree itself is well warranted today. Carrying on this image, the Bible Science Association, which is based in Minneapolis and is the second largest creationist organization, have published this tree of evil, in which it is shown that there are many evils of the world, certainly homosexuality, euthanasia, abortion, regulation of religion, and so communism, oppression, and that the trunk or the support of these evils is humanism, which they also don't understand. But please notice what is the root of this tree. Evolution. If you kill, you can get rid of all the evils of society if you only destroy the tree at its root. Did you notice there's kind of an odd parallelism in this tree? Did you notice one of the whole branches is science? I don't even want to talk about that. That's something that I just simply cannot fathom. Ironically enough, these are people who are very enthusiastic about science, so I don't understand the parallelism here at all. Evolution must be a pretty awful idea to have engendered all this opposition. Well, is this something we want our children to be learning? Well, of course not. Anti-evolutionism, of course, has had a long history in the United States. Whereas in Great Britain, evolution came to be accepted by both the scientific and lay communities in a matter of a few decades, in America, lay opposition to the idea flourished well into this century and, of course, is rampant today. In 1925, John T. Scopes was put on trial in Tennessee for violating the state's law against the teaching of evolution in schools. Tennessee was one of a score of states or communities that forbade instruction in evolution. These laws were brought by individuals who believed in the literal interpretation of Genesis and to whom evolution was an idea to be feared and opposed for religious reasons. Anti-evolutionists today, similarly, are biblical literalists, which remains an important component of the current controversy. It wasn't until a Supreme Court decision in 1962 that anti-evolution laws like that of Tennessee were declared unconstitutional. The reason? Because the purpose of such laws was to advance religion, they violated the First Amendment clause against the establishment of religion. Anti-evolutionists were dismayed but not down long. Because evolution could not be legally banned, the next strategy was to ameliorate evolution's evil effects by teaching the Bible alongside it. Tennessee passed the first equal time law in 1973, wherein the Bible was to be used as a supplement to any textbook having the audacity to cover evolution. It should not be surprising that this law was struck down as being patently unconstitutional. After all, what could possibly be more in violation of the principle of church-state separation than requiring presentation in the public schools of a sectarian religious view, that of biblical literalist, fundamentalist Christianity? Kentucky, on the other hand, you may be surprised to learn, passed in 1976 this statute that did not require the teaching of the Bible when evolution was taught, but permitted it. The statute reads in part, this is the statute down here, in any public school instruction concerning the theories of the creation of man and the earth, and which involves the theory of evolution, any teacher so desiring may include, as a portion of such instruction, the theory of creationism as presented in the Bible, and may accordingly read such passages in the Bible as are deemed necessary for instruction in the theory of creation. This is on your books right now. This is a very interesting statement. You notice that the Kentucky Revised Statute here does not say the theories of creationism as presented in the Vedas or in the North mythologies, or theories of creation as presented in legends of Australian Aborigines, or even theories of creationism as expressed by 20th century theologians. It says theories of creationism as presented in the Bible. This is specifically a single sectarian religious view. Now, I'll leave it to you and to Kentucky lawyers to figure out whether this is unconstitutional, but it's on your books right now. In Lexington in 1981, the statute was used as justification for the teaching of creationism in the public schools. I am pleased that the school board in Lexington did decide at that time, after a very long campaign spearheaded by scientists at the university and clergymen, by the way, it's an interesting component to the Lexington fight, the school board did decide not to teach creationism, but it would have been legal. But in most places, the notion of teaching the Bible alongside of evolution was given up as being hopelessly unconstitutional. So evolution could not be banned. Its evil effects could not be ameliorated by teaching the Bible alongside it. What is the anti-evolutionist to do? The next and current strategy of the creationists was to argue that biblical literalism can be made scientific, and to teach it as an equally valid scholarly alternative to evolution. They claim it is possible to support scientifically the idea that the universe, the earth, and all its creatures were suddenly created, essentially in their present form, a few thousand years ago. They claim that they can support with scientific evidence that the flood of Noah was an historical event, and that all the plants and animals that we see on the planet today are descended from the animals on the ark, and all humans are descended from Noah and his family. The addition of scientific evidence to creationism is the new wrinkle to anti-evolutionism of the last couple of decades, setting modern anti-evolutionists apart from their more manifestly religious predecessors. They themselves distinguish scientific creationism from other forms of creationism. The Institute for Creation Research distinguishes... Could you whack these lights here on the stage? Is that possible? I mean, I've got plenty of light here, but if this bank of lights right here could be gotten rid of, whoop! How about that?
Can't do it in a big
We don't have a choice, huh? Pardon? What are you telling me? Yeah, why don't you turn them on so we can see what we're doing? Aha, that looks. I'll bet you these lights do go off, and that would certainly help the visibility of the slides.
Some of those, Mike.
Yeah.
This is stage one, stage two.
This is Ruth has always been a mystery.
I can see why. No, try some other banks.
You probably can't read that, Jenny, anyway.
Yeah, that's probably true. Trust me. The Institute for Creation Research, in this Tenets of Creationism, steps 1, 2, 3, there I will read them to you, distinguishes 3 kinds of creationism. Thanks, Mike. Each of which is appropriate to different educational settings. Number 1 on that list is biblical creationism, relying solely on the Bible, which should be taught in church. Number 2 is scientific creationism, and this is what's important, relying solely on scientific evidence, and this should be taught in the public schools. Then I guess it's the best of all possible worlds, scientific biblical creationism, which combines everything, and this is what they want to have taught in Christian schools. Let me be very, very, very clear what it is I'm opposing. I am not opposing biblical creationists. I'm not opposing anyone who believes in the special creation of the universe for religious reasons. We at the National Center for Science Education have many clergymen who belong to our organization. They are creationists in the strict sense of the term. They believe God created. But there's a difference between believing God created and recognizing the fact that he's smart enough to do it through evolution if he wanted to, and he certainly left a ton of evidence to suggest that's what happened, and believing that everything appeared suddenly, kaboom, as a literal interpretation of the Genesis would suggest, and then going further to say you can support that with scientific evidence. My argument is against the claim that the literal version of Genesis is scientifically valid. I don't care if anyone wants to believe in the literal Genesis, that's fine. This is a free country, we have religious freedom, and I'll go to the mat for you, for your ability, for your legal right to do that. But don't try to say you can support it scientifically, and don't argue that you have a right to teach that to my kid in school. Because I want my kid being taught good science, and this is not good science. It's not science at all, it's religion. A very nicely put statement of what is often referred to as theistic evolution was issued in the early 80s by the Lexington Alliance of Religious Leaders. This is reprinted in a book that NCSE produces called Voices for Evolution. They say, as religious leaders, we share a deep faith in God who created heaven and earth and all that is in them, and take with utmost seriousness the biblical witness to this God who is our creator. However, we find no incompatibility between the God of creation and a theory of evolution, which uses universally verified data to explain the probable process by which life developed in its present form. What most 20th century theologians say is that the Bible tells us the whys of creation, science tells us the hows, and the two are not in conflict, unless your theology requires you to interpret the Bible literally. The conflict, this creation-evolution conflict, is not a conflict between science and religion. It's a conflict between biblical literalists and everybody else. In Lexington a decade ago, we had a big fight at the school board level over the teaching of creationism in the curriculum. My strongest allies as a scientist who was arguing against this were the clergy. The Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, the Jews, the mainline Protestant clergy, the Catholics and the Jews were my major supporters because they did not want biblical literalism being taught in the public schools. This is not an issue of science versus religion. Again, it's an issue of biblical literalism versus everybody else. This might be a good place to talk about evolution. What is it that the anti-evolutionists are anti? I have found that scientists have one definition of evolution and members of the lay public have a different one. So just so you know what I mean when I use the word evolution, why don't we take a moment to define a few terms here. I talk to teachers a lot, and I sometimes ask them, tell me what do your students think when you use the word evolution? What's your students' definition of evolution? And it's the same thing as what you find in the general public. What do you think the general definition of evolution is? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Oh, you're all so shy. Yeah?
Survival of the fittest.
No, actually, that's natural selection. You know a whole lot more than the general public. You don't count. That's it! That's it! Man descended from monkeys, or something like that. This is what you almost always hear when you say, what does evolution mean? Well, it means man descended from monkeys. This is wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. It's true evolution is about ancestry. It's true it's about descent. But you know, monkeys and apes are our cousins. You can't be descended from your cousin. You and your cousin shared a common ancestor. That's the relationship we have to monkeys and apes. We shared a common ancestor with them. We are not descended from monkeys and apes. Okay? They're cousins. You know, I do a fair number of talk shows on the radio. And people call in, you know, with these questions. And creationists seem to feel that they really have the silver bullet when they ask one question almost inevitably. And I'm just sick to death of hearing it. So if you ever hear me on the radio, don't ask this question. I'm tired of it. I almost always get a creationist who calls up and says, okay, if man descended from apes, how come apes aren't evolving into people now, huh? And this is supposed to be this really profound question. And of course, I mean, you know, after all, in my job, my board of directors tells me you should suffer fools gladly, and so I smile and I say very gently, no, that's not what evolution is about. Evolution is about organisms sharing ancestry in the past. And we and apes and we and monkeys have common ancestors. We are not descended from apes, I mean, except in a very general term of back in the Miocene or something like that, or more recently. But we are not descended from apes, so there's no reason for apes to be evolving into humans. They're evolving into something else. They're happily going on along their own evolutionary trajectory. But there's this real fondness for this. And you know, why aren't apes evolving into something else? I get asked this all the time. Well, did we miss a slide here? We missed a slide. No, we didn't. Yes, we did. That's it. That's okay. They're just slightly out of order. It's no big deal. Man descended from monkeys. The other thing that you hear a lot from the general public is something that I just called here molecules to man. This is another misunderstanding about what evolution is. Let's see what we have next. Good. The old ladder of life, or if you've had any history classes, the great chain of being. You all know about that. The notion that somehow you start off with this primordial ooze and amoebas evolve into jellyfish, evolve into fish, amphibians, and reptiles, and mammals, and apes, and by golly, what is at the end of this process? Homo sapiens. An incredibly anthropocentric view of what evolution is all about, and dead wrong. Dead wrong for two reasons. Number one, evolution does not culminate in us any more than it culminates in modern cockroaches. All of us organisms that are living today are the end product of evolution of some sort. There's no assumption that there's some sort of necessity that Homo sapiens is going to evolve. In fact, it's kind of a lucky accident that we actually did in many respects when you look at the fossil record. But it's also wrong because, it may come as a surprise, but fish did evolve into amphibians, but amphibians did not evolve into reptiles. Reptiles did not evolve into mammals. Go back to your paleontologist friends. You can discuss that in your classes. I mean, there's sort of a tetrapod that evolved into, you know, all the other kinds of varmints. But at any rate, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the general public as to what is evolution. Don't fall for the ladder of life. This is not a description of what evolution is. The essence of evolution is a historical question. What is the history of the universe? Is the universe as we see it today the same as it has been from the beginning, or has change taken place since the beginning? Has change taken place during the history of the universe? Notice that evolution has nothing to do with first cause. What happened before the Big Bang has got nothing to do with evolution. Some would argue that the Big Bang itself doesn't have anything to do with evolution. Okay? But what evolution is concerned about is after you start, wherever it is you start. If you start with the Big Bang, if you start with the first replicating molecule, wherever it is you start, what happened? Creationists say everything appeared kaboom just as we see it today. Evolutionists say no, change took place through time. That is the difference between creation and evolution. It's got nothing to do with did God create or did God not create. That's irrelevant to evolution. First cause is irrelevant to evolution. It's a different topic. Creationists confuse this quite a bit. Well, there happens to be abundant data supporting the notion that change has taken place. And these data come from every scientific field. This is a wonderful diagram. You could spend a whole semester on it. We won't. There won't be a quiz later either. But just consider that evolution occurs at an enormous number of levels. It occurs at the elemental level in physical phenomena. Molecules evolve. There's chemical evolution, things like DNA. There's also biological evolution, both primitive and advanced. But you can go beyond that. Evolution is also a concept that applies to ecosystems and even the whole globe as a system itself. Man descended from monkeys? Okay, that's one little tiny piece way down here. It's an extremely narrow view of what evolution is really all about. I think I just put that in a puddle of water. If you see me light up, you'll know why. Evolution is an idea that is relevant to physics, astronomy, chemistry, biochemistry, biology, anatomy, geology, astronomy. It's hard to think of a scientific field to which evolution is not relevant. It's relevant even in the social sciences because, of course, cultures and societies evolve as well. Evolution is an idea that is absolutely essential, absolutely central to the understanding of modern science. It is that simple. The geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the fathers of the modern synthesis of biology, said, "Seen in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Another scholar was even stronger in his appreciation for the importance of the concept of evolution in science. He said, "Is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforth bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. This is what evolution is." The maker of this statement, the Jesuit theologian Teilhard de Chardin. The general public is excruciatingly ignorant about evolution. Americans have been described as a nation of scientific illiterates, and we are especially illiterate about evolution, as shown by studies by John Miller. Over the last 15 years, John has conducted a series of national polls on American scientific literacy. These are polls of adults, not of school kids, people like you. His 1989-90 study compared Americans with British and some groups from other countries as well, and found that by and large we do about equally poorly with the British on most measures of scientific knowledge, but we do considerably poorer on topics having to do with the origin of the universe and of evolution. Here's some of his data from 1990 on general scientific knowledge. And you'll notice that, we do pretty well. We know oxygen comes from plants and Earth's center is hot. But when you get down to the lower part of this chart here, where you're getting into some of the historical sciences, the universe began with an explosion. We're not quite so good at that. We're 10% fewer than the Brits. This is percentage of correct answers, okay? The Earth circles the sun each year. That's a little bit shocking, isn't it, boys and girls? And if it's any consolation, the British aren't a whole lot better than that. But look at the basic evolution question here. Humans are derived from animal species. 46% of Americans said, yes, humans are derived from American species. Subtract that from 100, you get a whole lot of Americans who don't agree with that. And almost 80% of the British have no problem with the idea that humans descended from earlier species. That is almost twice as many British accept the idea of human evolution than Americans. I think that is an absolutely stunning statistic. Yet more stunning, humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. Only 37% of Americans knew that was wrong, okay? One rather depressing statistic I mean, there's lots of depressing statistics. One particularly depressing statistic from these studies is that Americans know less about evolution than they know about astrology. At least 60% of Americans know astrology is not scientific, but 63% of Americans think dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time. Now, but of course, we at the university can relax, because these studies are done on general Americans and we know they don't know anything. Surely college-educated Americans, college students, right? They'd know a whole lot more. They're educated, right? How many college students know, how many college students think humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time? Anybody want to take a stab? Chickens. Harold and Eve studied college students in Connecticut, California, and Texas in 1985, recent study. Over a third of the Texas students, paralleling the figure John Miller found for adult Americans, believed dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time. Unless you think that this is just merely Texas, and we all know how benighted Texas is, right? Over a quarter, well over a quarter, of the California and Connecticut students did also. Why do educated people know so little about evolution? Students today grew up on the Flintstones, right? Had little or nothing, and furthermore, had little or nothing to counter the idea that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. Very little evolution has, until just this year, been in textbooks that high school biology teachers use. And that was in the textbooks has been skipped by far too many teachers. So students never learned that dinosaurs died out millions of years before humans evolved. And worse, some are actually being taught misinformation. This handout was given to a third grade class in Illinois a couple of years ago. It refers to the Paluxy River footprints in near Glen Rose, Texas, which is a favorite creationist argument. I mean, after all, if human footprints are found with dinosaur footprints, obviously you evolutionists can't be right. You know, humans didn't evolve after dinosaurs. They were all wiped out together in the flood. And so they really like the Paluxy River. Well, you know any third graders? Talk about the epitome of dinosaur mania in elementary school. It's got to be third grade. You show a third grade kid a picture like this, and immediately those eyes just get rounder and rounder. He's thinking, oh, if only I had lived 10,000 years ago, I might have had my own Tyrannosaurus to ride. I mean, no matter what this kid's high school teacher tells him 5 years later, it's going to be real hard to shake that picture because there's a real emotional attachment to this idea. That this is not an isolated incident. I mean, this was from a grade school in Mahomet, Illinois. This is not an isolated incident. It was brought home to me by a phone call I received just a couple of weeks ago in California from a man whose wife was a kindergarten teacher in the town of Hayward, which is south of Berkeley, where I live, and which is already suspect right there. The teacher had done a little unit on dinosaurs for the kindergartners, and they had thought it was a lot of fun. One of the parents was observing in the class that day, and after the presentation, the parent came up and said that she was shocked that the teacher had not presented the idea that humans were living then too. And the teacher was a little bit taken aback by this, but the parent assured her she had lots of scientific evidence that this was the case, and she would bring it the next day. And the next day marched in with a stack of books, full color, glossy, slick books showing dinosaurs and humans trooping around in the Paluxy River as the wave of the flood started coming over the hills there. Part of my job is to provide information to people who have these kinds of problems, and so I sent her a ton of stuff on the Paluxy River, and I really don't know what's going to happen. But I want you to put yourself in that teacher's shoes, and I want you to ask yourself, what's the probability that that teacher is going to do a unit on evolution next year? Probably not real high. Well, what exactly are the creationists saying? They claim they have scientific evidence to support a literal reading of Genesis. They proclaim loudly they're not teaching religion, just an alternative view of science. Yet it is clear from a reading of their literature that religion dominates and determines their scientific conclusions. An example is this quote from Henry Morris, who says, "No geologic difficulties, real or imagined, can be allowed to take precedence over the clear statements and necessary inference of scriptures. So if the scriptures say the world is 10,000 years old, I don't care what your geology says. That's how old the world is. And all we need to do is look for the correct evidence that will prove this. In fact, in the very tenets of creationism that I showed you before that you couldn't see, put out by the ICR, it is stated, contrary to the operation of real science, that miracles are okay. What I will be reading to you from is number 6 here in the tenets of creationism, which I have kindly blown up for you so you can read it along with me. It says here, the processes today operate within fixed natural laws and relatively uniform process rates. Since these were themselves originally created and are daily maintained by the Creator, however, there's always the possibility of miraculous intervention by their Creator. In other words, if the experiment doesn't work, well, blame God. If you have a hole in your theory, well, a miracle occurred. You see a lot of resort to miraculous explanation in flood geology. They're really very big on flood geology and very big in explaining all of geology, for example, with the receding waters of Noah's flood. And the ark story is full of all sorts of requirements that you resort to miracles. During the question and answer session, you want to talk about the ark, I'll be happy to. It's a lot of fun. But the point of the matter is that these people feel it's perfectly fine to resort to miracles if the theory doesn't work. It's not the way science works. You can't resort to miracles. It isn't done that way. In a federal district court in 1982, after a full trial with creationist witnesses, creationist scientists took the stand and were cross-examined. There was a full couple-week trial. Creationist testifiers, evolutionist testifiers, including Steve Gould, by the way. A judge declared, and I quote, "The creationist scientific methods do not take data, weigh it against the opposing scientific data, and thereafter reach conclusions. Instead, they take the literal wording of the book of Genesis and attempt to find scientific support for it." The U.S. Supreme Court in 1987 declared that scientific creationism was, and I quote, "advocacy of religion." Although the Supreme Court decision was not as strong in its condemnation of creationism as the earlier Arkansas case. It appears that not only scientists, but judges as well, are convinced that scientific creationism is religion, not science. A classic example of how their religious views direct their science is in a genetics discussion in a creationist textbook of pandas and people. There is a large amount of genetic variation, as you know, in Homo sapiens. We have differences in skin color, in hair texture, size and shape, body morphology, and biochemical differences too, just to name a few. Creationists claim that all this enormous biological variation was produced out of the descendants of Noah and his family as they got off the ark and reproduced and repopulated the world, and that all this took place in a matter of a few thousand years, because according to them, the flood was only about 3,000 years ago, 3,200 years ago. Now, this is one whale of a lot of genetic variation to take place in that short a time. And they have been justly criticized by geneticists for arguing this. Well, they have an answer. This is an example of creation science. They claim in Pandas and People that two completely hybrid individuals could produce offspring exhibiting the complete range of possible skin colors. And here we have two individuals. I'm sorry, it's a black and white transparency. The picture's in color. This woman looks, well, they both are kind of swarthy. I mean, they're both sort of medium people, is I think what they were trying to convince you of. And the idea being that these two individuals could somehow produce this entire range of genetic variation, from people who look like Africans, people who look like Asians, people who look like Scandinavians. I mean, this is just incredible. And any biologist who would see this would go, huh? And this is what they want to teach in high school. In fact, I know a teacher in California right now who is teaching this. He's convincing his students that all you need to have is complete heterozygosity. I mean, this is just so crazy. I mean, anybody who's got any biology, just one tiny little reason why it's dumb, and there's plenty more. What happens if there's more than 2 alleles at a locus? What happens if you've got a triallelic or 4 alleles or 5 alleles or several alleles which can occur at a locus? You can't possibly have two individuals who are completely heterozygous for the trait. I mean, it's mathematically impossible. To say nothing of all the polygenic traits and everything else. I mean, it's just a ludicrous idea. Well, in addition, as I say, in addition to showing how religion drives their conclusions, this example also shows the scientific incompetence of creationism. When scientists read creationist literature, they discovered multitudes of factual errors. They find errors in scientific methodology, such as the frequent resort to miracles. And some might say, the less charitable would say deliberate distortion and lies. The more charitable would say sloppy scholarship. In fact, the science of creation science is so bad that even if it were not a transparent attempt to get religion into the science classroom, it would still not deserve to be taught. We should not waste our children's time learning bad science. They've got hardly enough time to learn good science, as short as the school week is. If one examines creationist literature, by the way, one does not really find evidence to support the sudden creation model. What you find is a cornucopia of arguments that evolution never took place. And this is because of a rather odd logic that creationists have that you need to understand what they're talking about. Creationists say there is only two possibilities. Here's the universe. There is either creation or evolution. There's no alternatives. Either creation occurred as it says in the Bible, or evolution occurred as it's said by modern-day scientists. Logically speaking, if not A, then B. From their standpoint, all they need to do is prove that evolution didn't occur, and by golly, what's left? Creationism. Therefore, creationism did occur. And so the creationist literature is just chock full of these kind of crazy arguments that say, well, here's something that evolution can't explain. Therefore, evolution didn't take place. Therefore, creationism is right. And that is the kind of logic you can find in creationists. I'm not really sure that's the kind of logic we want our kids learning, and it's even worse science. Let me give you an example of creation science. It illustrates the essentially anti-evolutionary approach, which I was just discussing, plus the generally sloppy scholarship and the reliance on outdated research, and in addition, their fixation on proving the Earth is young. It shows the kind of scholarship that has made scientists reject this field as a science. This example I've chosen from a multitude is a widely promoted theory of Dr. Thomas Barnes regarding the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, which you don't have to know a lot of detail about. The Earth's magnetic field is a phenomenon that allows you to find north and south on a compass. That's sort of all we need to know for this example. Well, this physicist believes that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying, it's losing strength, and that the rate of decay proves that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. Now, when you hear this argument, your first thought is not, this is a religious explanation. He doesn't say, the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is a function of a miracle from God. He just presents the data that the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is such that the Earth couldn't be any older than 10,000 years. It sounds really scientific, sounds like there's no religion involved. And it's arguments like this, in fact, that the creationists present to the general public to try to demonstrate that they are strictly scientific, that they have no religious foundations. Let's examine this example. Barnes cites measurements showing that since the 1800s, the Earth's magnetic field has been decaying. And extrapolating this rate of decay into the past, this would mean that the magnetic field would be impossibly strong in 8000 BC. No creature could have survived. In other words, the exponential decay rates of the Earth's magnetic field show the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. On the face of it, Barnes's fitting of a curve to the scattered data points looks like a reasonable approximation. The data points here are measurements that go back to the 1820s, actual measurements that were made on the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, and indeed the Earth's magnetic field is declining through time. And you fit a line to this, and that's cool. So it looks like there's something to this. But consider, a scientist can't extrapolate from too small a scatter of points. I mean, if you want to think about this in another context, if you were an economist and you had to pick one day of the stock market to predict the stock market for next year, it would make, you would not be able to come up with a very good prediction. You would need to have more points to make these kinds of extrapolations. And in considering the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, we don't have to rely upon these just the actual measurements. They're direct measurements that have been taken since the 1820s. It so happens that there are perfectly valid data regarding the history of the Earth's magnetic field, which we can obtain from fired artifacts like bricks and pottery and even some naturally fired ones that were fired, as it were, in volcanoes. But especially the bricks and pottery and archaeological materials that we have known historical dates for. And it can be shown in the laboratory that these baked artifacts are little preservatives of the direction and strength of the Earth's magnetic field that was extant when the pottery item was made. So that adds a whole bunch of new data. There's actual archaeological evidence of the strengths of the Earth's magnetic field through time that go far back beyond the 1820s. And if you look at the whole set of data that we have available to us, which the creationists ignore, dating back several thousand years, it can be seen that rather than the Earth's magnetic field declining in a linear fashion exponentially, we have a series of reversals where at some times the Earth's magnetic field decays, loses in strength. Other times it increases in strength and reverses. The North Pole, the South Pole, and so forth and so on. Here are actual data that are gathered from 3000 BC on, showing the changes, the fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. May I point out to you this little curve over here? This is the curve this is Barnes' curve. Barnes is only applying a tiny little fraction of the available data to his conclusion. And indeed, with Barnes is only looking at this much of the graph, and he's extrapolating that the Earth's magnetic field is going to be impossibly strong 1,000 years ago. This is not real good science, folks. What does this tell you about both the accuracy of creationist predictions as well as their scholarship? Now, as I've said, most of the time creationists simply attack evolution. Occasionally, however, they accidentally come up with a statement that can be tested. And when their statements can be tested and are tested, they are, I assure you, uniformly found to be wrong. Let me give you an example. This is a statement by Henry Morris about human population growth. This is kind of a fun one. He says the most probable date of man's origin, based on the known data for population statistics, is about 6,300 years ago. Now, he comes up with this figure by taking an annual population growth rate of 2%, don't ask where he gets that, and calculating, given the size of the present-day population at a growth rate of 2%, intrinsic rate of increase for you biologists, how long ago would it take before we got back to 2 people? And guess who those 2 people are? Well, he finds that it is, you only have to go back to about 6,300 years ago, and isn't that astonishing that that comes up to be the same date as it says in Genesis? What he uses is a linear model, something like what is shown on this graph. I mean, these are Morris's data. This is his slope, and down here at the bottom are is the time scale, 4,000 up to the present day, 2,000. And what he's done is given us something we can test. You know, historical statements, historical sciences like geology, and sciences like particle physics, where the phenomenon you're investigating is really too small to be directly observed. There's lots of sciences where you can't directly observe what you're studying. So what you often do is you test a hypothesis, you test theories based upon the logical predictions that that theory would make. So let's do the same thing with our friend Morris's prediction about population growth. Now, if there has been a linear 2% increase in population since Adam and Eve, he's making a prediction about population sizes at different times in history. Now, we know the pyramids of Egypt were built around 2600 BC. The creationists will agree with that. And we can imagine that there would be hundreds of people, even thousands of people, who were involved in the building of the pyramids. Not just necessarily schlepping the rocks around like Cecil B. DeMille, but people who would be growing the food to feed the workers and the priest class. And there must have been lots of people in Egypt at that time. Now, this line on the graph here shows the population at 2600 BC. Here's the time, and this is population. At 2600 BC, we go up to the line, and we follow it over, and we find out that there were 600 people on the planet at the time that the pyramids were built. Now, this is Morris's data, right? Now, what does this mean for the creation model? Well, it is a fact the pyramids were built about 2600 BC. And Morris's data estimate that only 600 people were alive at the time. The best case is that all these people were in Egypt building the pyramids. But this is really not very likely. It's more likely that people were spread over the surface of the earth about like they are now. And it's a fact that Egypt is about 1% of the land surface of the world, and if we assume a proportional spacing of people, that means 6 people built all the pyramids. Now, you know, you read the editorial pages about the decline of American industry. We really got to go back and take some lessons from these industrious Egyptians. I mean, they are models for us all, surely. All right. This, I think, demonstrates quite clearly the flaw in the creationist model on population growth. Do we want our kids learning this kind of science? Because this is what the creationists want to teach in the public schools of the United States, in science classes. Well, the National Center for Science Education acts as a clearinghouse for information on the creation-evolution controversy. Sometimes my office feels like we're on the top of this waterfall, because we're also the source of information for people around the country who need help fighting creationism. I have noticed a marked increase in the last 6 months of calls to my office saying help. And maybe one possibility is that NCSE is becoming better known, and so more people are showing up. But I really think there has been an increase in creationist activity in the last couple of years. The reason for that is because of the activities of the Institute for Creation Research. Now, this is the largest creationist organization in the country. They've got a 2-story building here, you can see it, a budget of over $3 million, and a mailing list of 100,000. I assure you the National Center for Science Education is considerably more modest. They are located in a suburb of San Diego in Southern California. This is the biggest of the creationist organizations, but they are not alone. There's plenty of other ones as well. For the past 2 years, the ICR has been conducting Back to Genesis symposia all over the country. They get an invitation, generally from a church or a religious school, to come to a community, and they bring their speakers and their film strips and their videotapes and their books for sale, and they just inundate the community there. They put on 2 days of speeches, invite the public in, charge the public money. People pay for this. There's got to be a way for us to somehow do this, but and basically what they do is they exhort their followers to take this wonderful new scientific information back to the teachers in the community. And then they go home, and the inspired visitors, the inspired participants of the Back to Genesis symposia go out and make life miserable for the teachers from then on. This is not, by the way, just 40 Baptists in a basement someplace. The Back to Genesis symposia are attracting thousands of people. In Massachusetts, they drew 4,000 people. In Michigan, last year, they drew 6,000. And in Sacramento, California, last summer, they drew 7,000. This is a substantial grassroots movement, and it is working. I'm tending to get calls from people within a few months of their having been a Back to Genesis seminar in a community. About 2 years ago, we noticed this article in the Acts and Facts, which is the newsletter produced by the ICR. Hundreds of public school students hear creationist evidences. They claim to have spoken to 30 science classes during their normal science lesson class time, quote. The anti-evolutionism was clear, if you look at the second column here. He says, it is important to make sure the students realize that evolution is only a belief, and that it is important to point out to students that there are many problems with evolution. But the essentially religious nature of these presentations is shown at the bottom. Local pastors will be following up with students. Okay, if this is such a red-hot scientific idea, how come the local pastors are following? Wouldn't it be sufficient for the biology teachers to follow up? I think this helps to demonstrate the essentially religious nature of this movement. Well, we were curious as to why public schools in Illinois were letting this religious view be presented in the science classes. So we got some of our NCSE people in Illinois to do some snooping around, and we discovered that one of the schools was Peoria. And this is a letter to our mole from Chester Duggar, who's the executive director of the high school programs. And Mr. Duggar explained that every so often a local organization will invite a staff member of the Institute for Creation Research to visit the Peoria area. When this occurs, an invitation is sent to each high school principal and each science department chairman, stating that the staff member will be willing, keep them away, willing to come to science classes to talk about the creationist point of view. Since our textbooks deal with the theory of evolution but do not contain information about creation science, we encourage but do not require science teachers to take advantage of this opportunity. I can get Mr. Johnson from the Flat Earth Society to come and talk to him too, but that's another story. We feel that this practice is consistent with our Board of Education policy that encourages the discussion of all sides of controversial issues. Also note the last line. For the past 12 years, we have allowed creation science representatives to visit science classes in our 4 high schools. No wonder a third of the population thinks dinosaurs and humans live together. They're learning it in high school. Explains a lot, doesn't it? But for lack of time, I could give you many other examples of the same sort of thing that is going on in other parts of the country. In Oregon, a school district is evaluating a request from parents to teach an intelligent design curriculum. That's a new euphemism, it's creationism. In Illinois, a school district grudgingly adopts high school biology books that are unbalanced in their opinion because they do not include creationism. The school board directs the staff to develop a unit on creationism that will be taught to students next fall. In California, a fundamentalist minister has for 12 years been coming to a junior high science class to lecture on creationism. He tells students that they can't be Christians and still accept evolution. In Southern California, a teacher has been reprimanded for teaching creationism and is about to sue the district for his First Amendment, free speech, academic freedom right to teach creationism if he wants to. A teacher in Texas laments that in the past we used to teach evolution, back when we had a superintendent that had some spine. Now we got an invertebrate, she said. I'm not teaching it. Creationism is thriving in every part of the country. I want to leave you with 2 thoughts. Commonly, I hear the argument, why worry about creationism? It can't hurt. Go ahead. Let them do it. Well, the creationist anti-evolution movement is keeping a large number of kids from being exposed to and understanding one of the most profound ideas science has come up with, rivaling and perhaps even surpassing only heliocentrism in its effect on science, society, literature, and theology. It is quite frankly cultural deprivation for a high school student, much less a college student, to graduate without a sound knowledge of what evolution means to Western culture. How can we do this to our young people? Another comment I hear all the time, and which is reflected in the Peoria letter, is that it's only fair to present creationism if we present evolution. It's only fair. What does he say here? It's consistent with the policy that encourages the discussion of all sides of controversial issues. Of course, it's not a controversial issue. Science has kind of got this wrapped up about 300 years ago, or at least for heliocentrism. The argument is made that teaching the 2-model approach gives the students 2 views, helps them learn scientific reasoning. Compare both sides. This is a culturally very powerful argument. America, bless it, is a nation that feels very strongly about equality, giving people their day in the sun. Hearing both sides, I think it's a wonderful cultural trait. It's irrelevant to science. Science is not a democratic process. We don't decide what state-of-the-art science is based upon how popular an idea is. We decide what state-of-the-art science is based on how well that idea explains natural phenomena. That's why evolution has stood the test of time. It explains natural phenomena extremely well. But the equal time argument is very, very culturally strong. A high school biology teacher in Chico announced, much to some of the parents' shock at a back-to-school night, Chico, California, a nice little college town in the northern part of California, that since the state of California did not allow him to teach both sides, he wasn't going to teach either. That's the way he felt, so he's just going to skip the chapters on evolution in the textbook that year. And of course, any good teacher is going to present alternative scientific explanations of a phenomenon, as long as there is evidence to support them and as long as the views are truly scientific. For example, there is valid evidence to support the view that evolution occurs slowly and gradually through time. There is other valid evidence to support the idea that evolution occurs after long periods of stasis and then very quick changes, punctuated equilibrium. A good teacher would teach these views. Both of them are scientific and both of them have data to support them. and actually the jury's still out as to which is more important in explaining the history of life. The problem with the equal time argument for teaching scientific creationism is that it's, in the words of my friend Thomas Jukes, equal time for nonsense. In the Creationists' 1989 National Convention, they had a keynote debate over whether the world was 10,000 years old or billions of years old. Okay, should you teach in geology that the Earth is either billions of years old or 10,000 years old and let the students decide? 4 years ago at their convention, they had a debate over, whether the sun is the center of the solar system or whether the Earth is the center of the solar system and the sun goes around it. This was the plenary session, the big debate that everybody went to and pondered. Okay, should we give equal time to geocentrism and heliocentrism and let the children decide? You can find in the creationist literature references to the notion that AIDS is a curse from God. Okay? Let's teach the virus theory of AIDS, and let's teach the demon theory of AIDS and let the children decide. Is this good scholarship? Is this good pedagogy? Is this good science? No, it's nonsense. I propose to you a very simple idea. Equal time makes sense only for equivalent ideas. If creationism, the sudden appearance of all living things, etc., could be made scientific, then it would, you could justify teaching it. It has been examined, it has been shown to be not scientific, it isn't even close. It is, in fact, thinly disguised sectarian religious belief that is being passed off as science. I think our students deserve better. I think our nation deserves better. Let's teach 20th century science so that we can be ready for the 21st. Thank you for coming.
You're attached.
Boy, am I ever. You want to...
Well, basically, Dr. Scott will entertain, there we go. Dr. Scott will entertain questions. I'm sure there's plenty of lively, potential for lively discussion, and we do that for the next, say, 10 minutes or so. Also, you're invited to a reception after the talk and questions are over at the Biology Department and Life Sciences Building. Yes?
Could you make some comment about your fears of the push now for the voucher system, tuition tax credit, eliminating public schools and going back to private schools in regard to this conference?
It is, of course, a huge debate that's going on right now about how to take the American educational system and give it a sufficient shake to really revolutionize it, to make the changes that need to be done, and still preserve a number of the characteristics of the American educational system that I think we all value, such as its pluralism, the fact that the school system is probably the one place in American society where all Americans are socialized together. I mean, that is a very important point. Vouchers, as you intimated, are a procedure that I think will further fragment this tendency that I already see in American education. Specifically in terms of science education, I think that it bodes ill. I think there's a tremendous amount of grassroots support for creationism. If people can send their kids, this sounds very anti-democratic, but if people can send their kids any place they want to, they may very well choose to send them to places where they will get the kind of education that they are happy with. And that is either good or bad depending on your point of view. Certainly there would be a tendency for religiously conservative individuals to send their children to schools in which the science that is being taught is not going to be like the science that they're going to get when they come to the University of Louisville or any other secular institution. But it's a broader question for society as a whole, certainly. I mean, you might also get academies that will teach ethnic histories. We will have a Chicano academy, an African American academy, and a white supremacist academy or something like that. I mean, I see that there's a great potential for mischief in the voucher system. But something radical has to be done with American education. It is a mess. And it is an incredibly complex system that is driven by state regulation, local regulation, teachers' unions, teachers' organizations, parents, apathy, textbooks. I mean, there's so many components, it's almost impossible. Yes?
What is the current state of scientific investigation into paranormal phenomenon?
The
Is
PSYCOP
anyone seriously looking at it even?
Oh, sure. There's an organization called PSYCOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. One of the more impossible acronyms, but nonetheless, CSICOP. Consists of a group of scientists and a lot of magicians, actually, who do examine claims of, say, ESP, UFOs, and the other whole laundry list of alphabet soup of paranormal phenomena. There's a publication that you should have in your library called The Skeptical Inquirer. If you're a teacher, I would strongly recommend getting it. Skeptical Inquirer is a wonderful source of information for teaching. If you want to teach your kids scientific methodology, take a look at the study that they did in Australia on dowsing, where they set up a controlled test, and they explain how they did it, and they got self-proclaimed dowsers, members of the Australian dowsing, you know dowsing, the water witching, they got members of the Australian Water Witching Society, and they all performed precisely as expected by chance under controlled conditions. It's a great way to teach your kids scientific methodology and simultaneously teach them that all the stuff that they're hearing in the tabloids and on television is probably less than meets the eye. Skeptical Inquirer, I would recommend it strongly. Yes, sir?
What are the other great religions of the world teaching the countries that these religions represent?
Scientific creationism is, as I say, basically a product of biblical literalism. And whatever traditions you find biblical literalism, you will find anti-evolutionism. There is some Muslim, we could call them fundamentalists, but that's probably not quite the right term, but you understand, I think, what I mean. There are Muslim literalists, there are charismatic Catholics who tend to be literalists, but the majority of adherents to creationism or anti-evolution are the Protestant fundamentalists. Now, wherever you find Protestant fundamentalism in large numbers, that's where you're going to find the creationist movement taking hold. It's pretty active in Australia. It's growing in Canada. It's moderate in New Zealand. There's a lot of anti-evolution there, but the creationists haven't really hit. It's such a small population, I guess they haven't really bothered. The creationists are very active in speaking around the world. If you read Acts and Facts, you'll find that they go to Korea, they go to the Philippines a lot. Both of these countries are countries in which evangelical Christians have been proselytizing very heavily. So wherever you see fundamentalist, particularly Protestant biblical literalist religion, that's where you're going to see scientific creationism. You know, there was one point that I skipped over that might be worthwhile mentioning, actually. I can stand it. If I was clever enough to have brought it with me, which I wasn't. There's a problem with looking at the creation-evolution controversy as a dichotomy. Okay. It is not the creationists on this side, the evolutionists on that side. It's a continuum. There are different flavors of creationists. You might even argue there's different flavors of evolutionists as well. I have someplace I have a transparency that shows, I had a slide actually, but I forgot to show it. If one were to look at a continuum from creation to evolution, the most far out of the creationists are the flat earthers. And there really is a flat earth society. It's run by this very nice man named Mr. Johnson, who is in Southern California, like so many of them. It's pretty flat down there. He lives sort of on the California-Nevada border. If you've ever driven through that country, you can kind of see why you'd think the earth was flat. This is a very small group, and the creationists are generally pretty embarrassed by them, and they almost really don't count. But they're there. I mean, that's one kind of creationism. And Mr. Johnson uses the same biblical kinds of quotes as do all the rest of the creationists in supporting his idea. Next to him, further along I guess toward the liberal, if that can be said, end of the spectrum, would be the geocentrists, those who think that the Earth is the center of the solar system and the sun goes around the Earth. This is also a minority view within modern creationism, but it exists. In fact, the secretary of the Creation Research Society is a geocentrist. And like I say, they would have plenary session debates about this. Next to them, further along the continuum, are the young earth creationists. These are the people that I've basically been talking about tonight. Sudden creation of everything a relatively short period ago. ICR, Bible Science Association, and so forth. Next to them are the old earth creationists, people who think, indeed, there was a sudden creation of everything, but they recognize that modern geology shows that the world is quite old, so they're willing to let this sudden creation of everything occur a long time ago. But they're still special creationists. Everything occurred kaboom. Next to them are theistic evolutionists. And these are the people, like many of the clergy who belong to National Center, these are individuals who believe God created, but they have no problem integrating evolution into their overall scene, their overall idea of the history of the earth. And then next to them would be what I've called materialist evolutionists. These are, Carl Sagan types to whom the cosmos is all there is and all there ever would be, and individuals who think that evolution occurred with no supernatural concomitant whatsoever. So, and we could subdivide it with a different taxonomy too. There's day-age creationists, gap creationists, there's all kinds of different flavors. But it's not a dichotomy, it's a continuum. But generally speaking, everybody sort of on the other side of theistic evolution is all anti-evolution. Other questions? Yes.
You said that there are some scientists who have embraced creationism. Is this a tiny minority of eccentrics, or can you explain why?
It is actually. The question was, there are some scientists who have embraced creationism. Are they a tiny minority or what? Actually, they are a tiny minority. When you look at the number of scientists who belong to something like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, or any of the other big societies, there are tens of thousands of scientists in this country practicing today. If you look at the number of people with graduate degrees who claim affiliation with creationism, they number about 600 or 700 members of the Creation Research Society. This number has remained stable for several years. I have a feeling it may start growing, but see, what's more important is not necessarily the number at the head, but the number of people they are convincing at the grassroots, which is the number that is truly growing. That book that I mentioned in the earlier part of my talk by Harold and Eve is really quite interesting. It looks at the notion that here are these individuals who should properly be part of the new class, as it is sometimes referred to by sociologists. The class of middle class and upper middle class people who make their living not based on inherited wealth or not off the sweat of their brows, but by their brains. People like most of you are going to grow up to be, or already are. Professors, computer types, accountants, people who work with knowledge. That's often referred to as the new class. The creationists, the creation scientists are part of this new class. And yet, in general, what we find is the new class tends to be rather secular in its orientation. The creationists are not. The creationists are actually, remember the slide of Morris with all the isms? The creationists in general find secularism very threatening because they are biblical literalists. They feel that America is going to hell in a handbag. The only way that we can stop that slide is to go back to the Bible, go back to Jesus. And family and decline of the family, decline of the U.S., the whole works, can all be stopped if we all became fundamental Christians. The rest of the new class doesn't really agree with that, and so this does set up a conflict, according to Harold and Eve, between this group of scientific creationists and the class with which they are basically having to deal. But they're socialized very differently. They're socialized to feel that secularism is really an evil idea. So according to Harold and Eve, and I think it's a pretty good hypothesis, in order to resolve this conflict, what they have done is embraced scientific creationism as a way of weaving into their worldview the science with which they deal every single day. But of course, it's very bad science. And a very interesting phenomenon about the scientific creationisms that I've dealt with. They tend to be much more accepting of scientific creationist pronouncements outside of their scientific field. So a geologist who is a scientific creationism will argue against flood geology, but he thinks probably the ideas about human evolution and genetics are okay. And a physicist might argue that the creationist arguments about the second law of thermodynamics are really kind of dumb, but that flood geology is real interesting. So, the psychology of scientific creationism is absolutely fascinating. And I would recommend this book for you to read, because I think you'll find it interesting.
Could you spell the author's name, please?
Eve, E-V-E, like guess who, Francis, and Harold, Harrold. Eve and Harold, two others. And the title of the book is, what is the title of the book? I never remember titles of books at all. That's why I write it down. The Creationist Movement in Modern America, published in December of last year by Twain, T-W-Y-A-N-E Publishers, out east. Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, it seems to me the term scientific creationism is an oxymoron. I prefer to say so-called scientific creationism, or some term which would alter it. But there's one aspect which I think has not been talked about in many circles, and that is, first of all, this really may basically be a way to draw people together through common fear. And that common fear is that there are a lot of complicated things in this world for which there aren't easy answers. And people like easy answers. But there is something else which is going on in this movement, it appears to me to be, that is also an opportunity and perhaps a very good means of gathering people together to be manipulated in the political process, to be involved in the political process as persons who can be shepherded to whatever thing seems to be important to the group. So they're really being set up. So I think it goes far beyond what we're looking at on the surface. There's something going on that's a lot more than that.
Well, I couldn't agree with you
Comment on
more.
that, please. I didn't mean to make
No,
such a
you made an
statement,
excellent
but,
point.
My question is a statement.
And I hear what you say, and I can't agree with you more. The scientific creationism movement is part of a much broader movement, which has been referred to as the new right or the religious right. It's an intersection of two circles, one circle being religious conservatism and the other circle being political conservatism, and where they intersect is the religious right. And there's a large number of topics the religious right is concerned about, including abortion, the family, and so forth, but creationism is one of them. And as you pointed out, I think very correctly, these issues are tied. And an individual may really be upset about abortion, but since anti-evolutionism is sort of tacked on to all of these other good causes, because they're all linked, they're all an example of this evil of secularism that is invading our society and keeping us from going back to Jesus, then we're going to be against evolution too. And I think your notion of bringing people together, solidarity, is so true. You know, I mentioned the Institute for Creation Research has 100,000 people. Dare I confess, the National Center for Science Education has fewer than 2,000. It is a great deal easier to get people excited about fighting evolution than it is supporting evolution. Like I say in my first slide with the ships falling off the side of the earth, most scientists use evolution every day in some facet or another, but they don't think it's necessary to defend it. I mean, it's like defending that the earth is not flat. I mean, it's a silly idea to most scientists. Unfortunately, it is part of a mass popular movement that could affect scientists, and certainly affects the students that come into their class. And what's kind of interesting is that scientists are definitely organized top-down. You know, scientists I belong to a zillion professional societies, probably you do too. They're all national societies, right? When was the last time, Russ, you got together with the local members of the American Association for Physical Anthropology? Well, we just are not organized on a grassroots level at all. On the other hand, members of these churches are. This is precisely how they are organized. And not only are they organized on a grassroots level, but that's the only level they have to worry about. And so when a decision has to be made to go to the school board and attack this new curriculum that has too much evolution in it, or fight against these textbooks that have too much evolution, it's easy to make because the decision's made right there. These are, in the theological sense, congregational in their organization. They're not hierarchical. So the anti-evolutionists have it all over scientists when it comes to this fight. One of the reasons why the National Center for Science Education got started about a decade or so ago was to establish groups of scientists and citizens in local communities on a grassroots level to try to defend evolution. These groups are called committees of correspondence. You've got a group here in Kentucky that does that. It's affiliated with the skeptics group, the psychop group, and it's called the CASES. What does CASES stand for?
Kentucky Association of Science Educators and Skeptics.
That's okay. You can chant it.
You might catch on.
And you should see these folks if you are interested in supporting this. Also, there's NCSE propaganda floating around. I, of course, would absolutely be ecstatic if you joined NCSE, because we need all the scientists and students and smart people we can to help us on this. But it is much more than just a scientific issue.
Do you see the general fear or the movement against evolution as part of a general mistrust of science in this country?
I don't. Some do, but I don't. I think the creationists are actually extremely fond of science. It's just that they have a very narrow view of science. One of the things that you'll notice if you examine the list of graduate level scientists who belong to the Creation Research Society or on the masthead of the ICR is that an awful lot of them are engineers. Now, if any of you are engineers, I don't mean to be stepping on your toes, but it just happens to be the case that a lot of engineers have a very narrow view of science. It's a very Baconian view of science. Science is direct experimentation, direct observation. Creationists make statements like, well, evolution isn't scientific. Nobody was there to see it happen. That's the kind of statement an engineer would make, if you don't mind me saying. We didn't build the bridge right, it fell down. I mean, it's sort of direct experimentation, direct observation kind of approach. Well, modern science isn't like that. Creationists love science. It's just that their view of science is about this wide. Their view of science doesn't incorporate some of these broader indirect testing scientific research designs and so forth that modern science uses. And they're very suspicious about the historical sciences. Yes?
Since George Bush is such a religious man, do you have any idea where he stands on this?
You know, one of our members has written him with just that question, and he's gotten a real runaround. He's gotten back all sorts of long letters signed from various, hacks up the way, but nothing about. We don't know what George Bush thinks. Now, given the denomination, he's Presbyterian, I think. Now, given Episcopalian, generally speaking, I mean, Episcopalian theology is not literalist. On the other hand, there's often a gap between the seminary-trained professional behind the podium and the people in the congregation in front. So, I mean, literalist Episcopalians are pretty rare. On the other hand, I heard about a group of charismatic Unitarians the other day, and so who knows what can happen.
If the difference between animal and man is rational thinking, how did that evolve?
Well, I'm not sure the difference between animals and humans is rational thinking, but I think it certainly could evolve. I think that we see a marvelous gradation when we study animal behavior of different abilities through different phyla, and when we look at some of the abilities that we find in higher primates, they are really quite striking. It may be that we are dealing with degrees of kind rather than with differences in kind rather than differences in degree. An animal behaviorist would be better able to answer that. But certainly the difference in degree is profound between us and chimpanzees. But, like I say, chimpanzees and us shared a common ancestor. They evolved from that common ancestor, specializing in certain kinds of traits. We evolved along our track from that common ancestor, specializing in other traits. Natural selection operated differently on chimpanzees and gorillas than it did on us. We're the ones who ended up with the big cerebrums.
A related question to that one would be this: if science cannot explain how rational thought evolved today, if today science cannot explain it, will will that mean that the creationist explanation is correct?
Yeah, the fact we don't have an explanation today does not mean we won't have one tomorrow.
Precisely.
And again, this is sort of that, if not A, then B, you know. If evolution is wrong, then creation is right. It's not the way it works. Did you have any? Oh, thought I had somebody with their hands up. Yes?
I was gonna say, how do you, approach, the problem, people who are willing to accept miracles as a part of, the history?
Well, actually, I mean, it probably comes as no surprise to hear me say that I'm not out to convince creationists. I mean, I see the world in terms of continuum, obviously. And on this continuum, we have over here people who are committed evolutionists, and I don't need to convince them. We have over here on the other end of the continuum people who are committed creationists, and I'm not going to be able to convince them. I'm not really trying. We have an awful lot of people in the middle who don't know much about science, who know hardly any evolution at all, and what they know, it's wrong. And they are probably, the majority of them are not biblical literalists. Those are the people I'm talking to. Okay. What I'm trying to do is get out enough understanding of how science works, enough understanding of what evolution is, what evolution truly is, not the creationist misstatements of it, and why creation science is not a replacement for evolution, because it is such terrible science. And I'm trying to convince that middle group rather than, either the. Although coming to a group like this, in which the majority of you I know are over here on the committed evolutionist side, one of the things I'm trying to do is whack you over the head with a 2x4 and get you interested in this controversy so that you will be aware of it and do something about it. Did you? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
How do scientific creationists respond to things like carbon dating and facts like that? I mean, what type of arguments do they come back with?
Radiocarbon dating is no good. It's based on faulty assumptions. And besides, did you know that a living mollusk was dated using carbon-14 processes and was found to be 3,000 years dead? Obviously, you can't trust radiocarbon dating. And that is not a creationist research article. That is an article from Science magazine. And it is. Except that article is talking about riverine versus lacustrine mollusks and how you can't use lacustrine, riverine mollusks for radiocarbon dating because of the nature of riverine systems and the accumulation of the various isotopes that are involved in carbon-14, and you get faulty dates.
They ingest ancient calcium carbonate, and so carbon is old.
Right.
So the carbonate is old.
Right. The article from Science magazine Creationist site is an article that is refining the technique of carbon-14 dating. But they reject all of them. I mean, they're all based on faulty assumptions. Any date that comes up with any date that's older than about 10 or 20,000 years is suspect right away, regardless of procedure. Well, I think you people have been extraordinarily patient and a marvelous audience, and I've sure enjoyed this a great deal. But I think you all need to stand up and stretch and walk around a little bit. Thanks very much.